Just 1 week after Eden's visit to Cairo, Israel made a raid on Egyptian territory in Gaza, killing 36 Egyptians and Palestinians on what had been a troubled frontier. Nasser came under severe pressure to equip the Egyptian army and the Palestinian fighters against the Israelis. He looked to Britain to buy arms.
Finally, he said to his quartermaster general, look, get over there and just find out what they're prepared to sell us. I don't buy anything. Pea shooter, catapult. See where they are. And there was an argument about everything. There was even an argument about some biplane, and the quartermaster clearly went back saying, you're not going to get anything out of them. Don't bother trying.
As Britain, along with the Americans, would not sell Nasser arms, he was determined to look elsewhere. To the horror of the West, Nasser made a deal with the Soviet bloc.
It was a big shock, because it suggested that the threat of communism spreading through the Middle East was real, and that Nasser had, in a sense, sold out.
Eden finally realized his dream of becoming Prime Minister. And while Eden began promoting his vision of peace and prosperity to an adoring nation, Nasser was devising his own strategy to bring Egypt into the modern world. He wanted to build a dam across the River Nile. The building of the Aswan Dam was seen as a cure for all Egypt's ills, and Nasser staked his own position and prestige on the success of the project. The main obstacle for Nasser was finance. The World Bank agreed to lend Egypt $200 million, with the United States and Britain pledging additional millions. But in London, Eden feared that Nasser's plan to build up Egypt would extend his influence to neighbouring Arab states and eclipse British control in the Middle East.
I think we were concerned with Nasser's influence outside Egypt as much as we were concerned with his influence inside Egypt.
For Eden, Nasser's most irritating means of influence was still Egyptian radio.
The voice of Egypt continues unchecked and pours out its propaganda into the area of our oil fields. We have simply got to take action as quickly as possible.
This suspicion of Nasser was further inflamed by Selwyn Lloyd, Eden's foreign secretary. On meeting Nasser in Cairo, he wrote,
Nasser was fatter and more self-confident than when I saw him last. He smiled a great deal more, for no apparent reason. He did not exactly condescend, but he gave the impression that he could do more harm to us than we could do to him.
Eden was already getting disenchanted with Nasser, and I think Selwyn's communications were simply reinforcing this conviction that Nasser was an unmitigated menace to British interests, capable of essentially subverting what we regarded as friendly regimes, from Baghdad to Saudi Arabia to Jordan.
He saw him certainly as an Arab nationalist, which he was, and that in a sense, of course, was a threat to the more traditional regimes. But he also saw him as a potential agent of the Soviet Union.
At the same time, MI6 intelligence reports suggested Nasser was in the pocket of the Soviets, plotting to overthrow every Arab monarchy. These reports were later proved suspect, but they fueled Eden's increasingly hostile view of Nasser.
The pattern is familiar to many of us, my friend. We all know this is how fascist governments behave. And we all remember, only too well, what the cost can be in giving in to fascism.
He, after all, had really made his name, resigning from the Chamberlain's government in the late 30s, standing up to the dictators, being Churchill's foreign secretary throughout the war, and he just believed that you had to stand up to dictators.
I think his view of Nasser was that Nasser was dangerous, and that he was a dictator and that you ought to stand up to him, and surely whatever the cost in money and blood, you had to do this.
Eden, who didn't need much to fuel his suspicion of Nasser, decided the game was up. It was time to try and get rid of him.
Secretly, Britain considered different options against Nasser.
MI6 undertook very many activities. It had embedded itself into the Suez Canal Company. The goal of this was to attack the regime, or to participate in any attempt to assassinate Nasser by one means or another.
I think by subversive Nasser, perhaps people like the Prime Minister might mean not flinching from covert activity. In such cases, you say, what would happen if something were found out to be so about Nasser? If necessary, some semi-fabricated thing about Nasser which would discredit him in Arab eyes. What would happen if an Egyptian assassinated Nasser?
Eden made his views clear when he called the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, who was having dinner at the Savoy.
What's all this poppycock you sent me? This nonsense about isolating Nasser or neutralizing him, as you call it. I want him destroyed, can't you understand? I want him removed. And if you and the Foreign Office don't agree, you'd better come down to Cabinet to explain why.
There was no attempt on his life or anything that I know of. It certainly was never put into practice. The mood wasn't focused on that, if you see what I mean. But it was obviously an option.
Nasser's power was in the ascendant. 10 days after the last British troops left Egypt, Nasser became president. It was the end of 74 years of occupation. But the Egyptian celebrations were short-lived.
A man who was the president of the World Bank, Eugene Black, came to dinner and told us, we just committed the biggest blunder in the history of the world today. And I said, what? He said, on the orders of Mr. Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State for Eisenhower, he said, we refused to loan Nasser money to build the Aswan Dam.
Nasser was not even told this devastating news personally. He heard it second-hand.
We were on the plane with President Nasser and President Nehru. They were sitting next to each other when President Nasser looked over at me and said, see what the international news is. The first item on the BBC was a statement by an official American spokesperson saying that the United States had taken the decision to cut off the financing of the High Dam. Plainly speaking, Egypt was bankrupt.
As Nasser was regarded, both by us and by the Americans, as having sold out to the Soviet Union, neither of us were prepared to go ahead and finance the dam. But it had to be done with a certain care, because obviously it was going to provoke some sort of reaction.